Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight, we journey to the misted fields and candlelit halls of 9th century England, where the air carries the smell of hearth smoke and wet wool, and quiet footsteps trace the worn paths between scattered kingdoms. The wind moves over low hills, touching villages that sleep beneath uncertain stars, and somewhere, a young prince named Alfred studies by the light of a wavering flame. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. The picture settles slowly, like silt in a quiet river, and we start with the small human facts beneath the banners and dates. 9th century England was not a single country, but a stack of neighboring households with complicated long memory. The people ruling those households, kings with careful beards, bishops with ink-stained fingers, nobles with land that stretched as far as the next legal argument, woke most mornings to the same practical concerns as anyone else. Food, reputation, an heir who wasn't currently sulking, a rival who wouldn't go away. The map that schoolbooks call Anglo-Saxon England was in daily life more of an extended family argument conducted through charters, hostage exchanges, and the occasional very inconvenient battle. It did not help that the royal families were as interwoven as a hedgerow, which was helpful for diplomacy right up until someone wanted a divorce, which was not a thing, or a throne, which was always a thing. It's a sleep-facing truth that the men who became historical actors were also bodies with aches and routines. They dressed by light that arrived late in winter and too early in summer. They ate salted meat in months when the kitchen staff felt like mad scientists with a barrel and a hope. They worried about the weather the way a modern executive worries about email, constantly, and with an air of polite doom. And if they were kings, they had an extra layer of performance to maintain the mild theater of presence. Sit straight, look capable, do not sneeze during oaths, and attempt not to show how often policy is just delaying a worse decision. In Wessex, the southern kingdom that will matter for our slow drift through the years 865 to 878, a youngest son named Alfred is growing into this performance. He is not the heir, he is the spare, and a spare learns patience, the way a scribe learns ink. Born in 838 or 849, Alfred was taken to Rome as a child, twice, if we trust the sources, shown the city like a sermon in stone, and given the sort of royal attention that creates a rumor that the Pope somehow anointed him. No reliable document suggests he was crowned anything in Rome, but people in the 9th century also enjoyed a tidy story that makes a future make sense. Even then, Alfred was being set up as a symbol, whether he liked it or not. What he did like increasingly was learning. He grew up in a world where books were expensive, literacy was a superpower, and a king with a taste for texts was a little suspect to those who preferred a straightforward afternoon of spear practice. Alfred would later complain gently, like a patient teacher, that few people around him knew Latin, and not enough even read Old English comfortably. It wasn't a snub, it was a project proposal disguised as lament. He admired good words and useful laws, the way some princes admired horses with pretty gaits. This is not a heroic poster. It is a young man who looked at a shelf and saw perhaps a way to breathe when politics felt tight. He also seems to have suffered from a chronic illness that flared at stressful times. The exact diagnosis is unknowable at this distance. Medieval writers describe pain and weakness with the same imprecision they used for weather. Too much, not enough, strange in April, and physicians had very few tools beyond observation, and courage. The symptoms might suggest a gastrointestinal condition or a persistent genitourinary problem. It was not fatal, obviously, but it was inconvenient. It shaped his days. That matters because history tends to hide the inconvenient in favor of the triumphant. What we have instead here is a future king whose body set boundaries and whose mind developed workaround. It gives his later reforms a human scale, a man who planned around pain, understood the value of systems that function when people do not. Elsewhere, the island hummed with its old political music. In Northumbria, far to the north, the throne had been a revolving door fitted with a dagger. Kings Osbert and Ella had managed to offend overlapping groups of powerful people, which was not unusual. If you lined up the last dozen Northumbrian kings, you would see an excellent demonstration of why the local nobility considered assassination a policy instrument. In Mercia, the Midlands Kingdom, King Burgred held on to power with the longing of a person clinging to a door frame while the floor shifts. He was married into the West Saxon family, useful, but his long-term plan mostly involved hoping everyone else would be too tired to cause problems. In East Anglia, King Edmund, devout and earnest, governed a realm of well-drained fields and churches, with libraries that made nearby abbots quietly jealous. He was admired for piety, which was good for the soul and moderate for geopolitics. Across the sea, in the Scandinavian world, things were also moving, and as usual, the weather gets some of the blame. Population pressures, political ambitions, and economic opportunities braided together. Younger sons and tough uncles looked westward and saw shorelines that paid. We call them Vikings, which is more a job description than a nationality. To go Viking was to take to sea for trade and raid, in an era when those words sometimes shared a ledger. The famous names that float through later sagas, Ragnar, Ivar, Halfdan, Uber, arrive for us not as bronze statues but as fragments in several sources, none of which were written by their friends. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled by monks who saw the smoke first and the theology second, calls what came in 865 the Michael Heathen here, the great heathen army. It was not the first fleet to appear on English coasts, but it was the first that looked like a long-term lease. Here, gently, we decline the temptation of embellished theatre, stories about Ragnar's death in a snake pit and a blood eagle revenge ritual belong to later texts and complicated poetic traditions. Modern scholars tend to treat the most gruesome versions as literary. In other words, they say more about the needs of storytellers than the habits of 9th century torsos. What is sturdier is the record that a large organized multi-leader force came to England, not just to smash and sail away, but to winter, to negotiate, to extort, and to move on again in the spring with new horses and better maps. That's not a sing-along ballad, that's logistic. The army's leaders behaved like a board of directors with matching cloaks. Ivar, called the Boneless in later sources, for reasons that remain a conversation, shows up in Irish annals as a formidable figure. Halfdan and Orba appear as brothers in some traditions, though pedigrees are a field sport all their own in this period. They do not need to be tidy to be real. They needed only to be effective. And they were. Their ships aimed at East Anglia first, not because Edmund had offended the gods, but because East Anglia had horses, and an army that does not want to be pinned to riverbanks, prefers hooves to oars once ashore. Edmund chose the strategy many rulers chose when a force of that size set up camp and demonstrated an interest in overwintering. He paid, it was called tribute, from one angle, and rent from another, and it bought time, which was what most kings were always buying with whatever currency they had. East Anglia's winter of 865-866 was, for the army, a season of planning camps and adjusting to local conditions. For the residents, It was the awkward experience of hosting uninvited relatives who use your pantry like a concert. Horses were trained, routes learned, and quietly the leaders decided that Northumbria's internal feud, Osbert versus Ella, was a ladder someone had left leaning against a wall. In 866, the army moved up the coast and took York, a city so beloved by everyone who held it that they all forgot to defend it properly. It was a center of trade, faith, and pride, and the army seized it with a speed that suggests surprise on one side and professional experience on the other. What followed was not merely plunder, it was occupation. Walls were repaired, winter quarters were made. A message went out to anyone paying attention. This was not a weekend trip. Northumbrian politics tried to rally itself and performed about as well as a group project, with 2 leaders and no plan. Osbert and Ella combined forces, because nothing encourages cooperation like an external threat parked in your best city. They attacked, the army held, both kings died. The famous story that Ella suffered a spectacular ritual death is again mostly the sort of tale that flourishes when an enemy needs to appear especially punished. The more sober possibility is that he fell in battle, or after it, the way many kings did when their plans ran out of steps. What matters for our gentle thread is that Northumbria's upper tier was now a bowl of loose marbles. The army placed a compliant local noble as ruler north of the Tees and kept the south in its own hands. The word puppet is modern. The sensation of being ruled by someone who looks familiar but answers to strangers is not. Meanwhile, in Wessex, the younger son with books was inching closer to a role he likely never expected to fill so soon. Alfred's eldest surviving brother, Ethelred, took the throne in 865 after their father's death, and Alfred became the public companion to a king, first helper, most visible advisor, the person next to the person. This is where his style shows. He didn't posture as a war god. He supported the work of keeping the house standing. He attended councils, rode circuits, and managed correspondence with a steady patience that was about as glamorous as a well-swept hearth. He also married Elswith of Mercian lineage in 868, which made practical sense, and judging by a life spent together and a raft of children, apparently worked as a partnership. She came from a family that knew both church and war. She would later found religious houses with the calm efficiency of a woman who understands budgets. The couple's domestic life, to the extent we can glimpse it through cautious lines in charters and a few remarks in later biographies, was busy. They had at least 5 children who reached adulthood, including Edward and Ethelfled. If you want a quiet smile, you can imagine the bedtime logistics of a royal hall with infants while emissaries negotiate in the same building. Alfred's illness did not remove him from family life or governance. It threaded through them. There are reports of severe bouts around major turning points. And while medieval writers love a dramatic correlation, pain tends to have a way of appearing at precisely the worst moments without needing a push from narrative. In 868, as the army moved through Mercia, Ethelred and Alfred responded to appeals for help from King Burgred. Assistance is a polite word. Wessex sent men because a ravaged Mercia was a gift to no one but the people doing the ravaging. Skirmishes happened. Negotiations did too. The army withdrew, paid off, and not particularly chastened. Each season taught everyone a small lesson. For the West Saxons, the lesson drifted toward the need for flexibility. Horsemen, rivers watched, fortifications prepared, and the acceptance that the old rhythm of spring campaigning was now accompanied by the newer practice of wintering foes who negotiated in one breath and raided in the next. For the army's leaders, the lesson was that the southern kingdom would not fall like the northern one. It would need more time, and perhaps a second act. The next years drew East Anglia back into the spotlight, and this is where the human oddness of sanctity and politics meets a very practical question. What do you do with a captured king? Edmund's death in 869, later framed as a martyrdom, became the sort of story that supplies a people with both grief and identity. Contemporary accounts from decades later emphasize his refusal to abandon his faith. The goriest details that show up centuries after are precisely that. Later, we keep things quiet here. A ruler died in captivity. His cult grew, carefully tended by clerics who needed a local saint as both spiritual beacon and post-disaster civic project. Villagers and abbeys cooperated in remembering Edmund in ways that turned sorrow into infrastructure, shrines, processions, and the kinds of donations that keep roofs on in wet winters. The army found itself facing not only soldiers in the field, but also the long, stubborn power of stories that comfort the defeated and over time train children to think in terms of us and them. By 870, the us and them had clarified to an awkward degree. 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon realms were damaged, occupied, or wobbling. Wessex remained, more or less upright, the way a well-built table stays on its feet after someone has leaned too hard on the other 3. Alfred, still prince but increasingly a public face, spent these months moving between piety and policy, a combination the 9th century took for granted. He witnessed charters, attended councils at places like Kingston and Winchester, and watched how his brother managed the strain of rising levies, threatened borders, and the social fatigue that sets in when communities have been mustered one too many times at harvest. It was during this period that his health reportedly sank again, an unhelpful reminder that even determination needs a body that cooperates. And yet, life kept occurring in ordinary ways around the extraordinary. Children were taught their prayers, noble households argued about dowries, abbesses managed estates with more competence than some earls. Craftsmen repaired ships using timbers that had been trees when Charlemagne was alive. Alfred's court functioned because women organized it, and clerics staffed it, and minor officials did the annoying essential work of measuring, tallying, and swearing they had in fact delivered the correct number of cheeses to the royal kitchen. None of these people show up in battles, which is sometimes why the battles are survivable. At the end of 870 and into 871, the great heathen army pressed deep into Wessex and built a base at Reading, ringed by rivers and ditches, the way a hedgehog is ringed by prickles. West Saxon forces fought sharp actions: Inglefield, Reading, Ashdown, Basing, Maratoon, in a sequence that felt to participants like a year of weather, a hard frost, a sudden thaw, a discouraging sleet. The famous win at Ashdown gave hope without stability. The subsequent losses took both hope and breath away. Alfred fought in these engagements next to his brother. He learned what every commander learns the unfun way, that victory is expensive, defeat more so, and the quiet days between cost almost as much in uncertainty. When Ethelred died in the spring of 871, probably from wounds sustained in the campaign, the crown landed on Alfred because crowns need places to land. He was about 22. He was also an exhausted field commander with a small child, a worried wife, a temperamental stomach, a treasury that looked like a carefully tidied cupboard with a single loaf left, and an enemy that had just received reinforcements. A great summer army, as contemporaries put it, with admirable understatement. It is easy to narrate this as a heroic turning point. It felt, at the time, like being handed the keys to a house on fire. Kingship, for Alfred, did not begin with a parade. It began with the math of survival. He could not fight everyone, everywhere, all the time. He could not ask the same shires to show up month after month without their fields collapsing and their patience following. He could not pretend the army would dissolve if ignored. He could, however, negotiate their departure for a while, buy time, and start building the sort of layered defenses that make a kingdom annoying to conquer. This would become his reputation, not a dazzling one-day genius, but a deliberate engineer of systems, births, musters, ship designs, law codes, teaching programs that quietly borrowed from older practices and stitched them into something the island had not yet tried at scale. What also quietly began, right then, was the private discipline to match the public plan. Alfred's health did not miraculously stabilize. He adapted to it. His marriage did not pause. He and Ælfswith navigated it, while raising children who would someday inherit tasks instead of gardens. His love of learning did not evaporate. It deepened into the kind of reading that solves problems, the kind a tired adult does with a candle and a schedule. If you want the human center of the story that will now move toward 87-8 and Eddington, it sits there, a young king with uneven energy, an accurate sense of his limits, and the talent for turning limits into structures other people could stand on. For the moment, though, we end the first stretch with the long inhale before a longer exhale. The army shifted toward London at the end of 80-71. Wessex lived to count its losses and look over its hedges. Alfred began the slow, unshowy work of making a kingdom that would not break the next time someone pushed on 3 corners at once. The island slept badly. The ruling families slept to work, but sleep, even the thin kind, is where plans form when daylight is not available. And plans were exactly what the quiet prince turned anxious king knew how to make. What followed was less a pause than a long, strained silence where everyone pretended to be resting. The Vikings, content with the silver they had coaxed out of Wessex, shifted their camp from Reading to London, and then deeper into Mercia. Alfred, who had inherited a country more exhausted than defeated, began rebuilding in the gaps between crises. Paying tribute might have looked weak in poetry, but in practice, it kept fields planted and children fed. He was not buying safety, only postponing destruction, and postponement is a form of strategy when there are no good options left. Through 80-72 and 873, England drifted like a patient recovering from fever. The great army wintered at Repton in Mercia, fortifying an old royal site and turning it into an emblem of humiliation. Excavations, centuries later, revealed burials that hint at the army's size and rough discipline, mass graves, weapon offerings, fragments of coins from across Europe. To the monks who recorded such things, the camp was blasphemy built over saints' bones. To Alfred, reading the reports, it was data evidence of an opponent with engineers and patience, not just courage. He knew the worst threat was not chaos, but organization. At Repton, the army helped end Mercia as a functioning kingdom. King Burgred fled to Rome, one of the more elegant ways to surrender, and a client ruler named Ceolwulf took his place, pledged to deliver taxes and hostages on demand. The arrangement preserved the appearance of local order while draining the region's resources for Viking logistics. The army split soon after, a corporate division of labor that would define the next years. Halfdan led one portion north to settle permanently in the old Northumbrian lands. The other, under Guthrum and several co-leaders, stayed in the Midlands, restless and ambitious, their eyes fixed again on the south. Alfred used this lull the way a builder uses a dry day. He reorganized local defense, clarified who owed what service to the crown, and tightened the record-keeping that later chroniclers would mistake for paperwork. To him, it was survival infrastructure. He visited shrines, consulted bishops, and tried to convince a weary people that patience was not the same as surrender. His health still fluctuated. There are quiet suggestions that he turned to prayer and fasting, not out of zeal but to manage pain. The result, ironically, was a reputation for holiness. Medieval politics liked its ironies subtle. Wessex itself was patchwork resilience. Towns repaired their wooden walls. Monasteries restocked libraries because burned parchment was a moral emergency. Craftsmen rebuilt bridges over the Thames and Avon so soldiers could actually reach the next emergency. Families resettled farms abandoned during raids, measuring the seasons by how many roofs were rethatched rather than how many raids had been endured. Everyone knew the army would return. The question was when and in what mood. In 874 and 875, news drifted south that Halfdan settlers were dividing Northumbria into farming plots, not plunder. For the first time, an Anglo-Saxon chronicler used the word ploughing about former invaders. It was a small linguistic earthquake. Raiders had become residents. Their children would speak both tongues and invent a hybrid culture along the rivers Ouse and Tyne. Meanwhile, Guthrum's half of the army was not ready for ploughs. He wanted kingdoms. He advanced methodically, wintering at Cambridge, and then moving into Wareham in Dorset. The town's location near the coast made it perfect for supply ships and quick escapes. Alfred surrounded him with what men he could gather. There was no appetite for a decisive battle, just mutual observation across a wet landscape. Negotiations followed. The Vikings swore oaths on the Holy Ring, a sacred Norse symbol of binding promise. Alfred accepted their pledges to leave Wessex. Everyone knew those promises had a shelf life, shorter than salted fish, but oaths allowed both sides to breathe. The break did not last long. Guthrum slipped away from Wareham under night and captured Exeter, farther west, hoping to control the approaches to Devon. Alfred pursued, besieged, and again found weather on his side. A storm destroyed the Viking reinforcement fleet off the coast, scattering or sinking 100 ships. The survivors capitulated, swearing again to leave. By late 87, they withdrew into Mercia, and Alfred finally enjoyed what looked like peace. The chroniclers record it with cautious sentences, as if afraid that enthusiasm might summon thunder. That winter of 1877 was cold and bright. The fields were quiet. The levies went home. People who had spent a decade sleeping in armor tried to remember how to celebrate Christmas without scanning the horizon. Alfred retired to his estate at Chippenham, near the Wiltshire woods, a reasonable place to rest. He had learned to treat calm as temporary, but even disciplined minds tire of vigilance. The army, now under Guthrum's complete control, understood that exhaustion as clearly as any map. The attack came in early January 1878, during the Festival of Epiphany, when no one expected war. The Vikings rode through frost and darkness straight to Chippenham, moving fast enough to make disbelief part of their weapon. They overran the royal estate, seized supplies, and scattered the court. Alfred fled with a small band of loyal men, probably household guards, into the wetlands of Somerset. For all practical purposes, Wessex ceased to exist. The marshlands of the Somerset levels were an unlikely refuge. Flooded fields, narrow ridges, islands of alder and willow. To anyone not raised there, it looked impassable. That was its value. Alfred hid in this watery labyrinth, slipping between reed beds while Guthrum's men occupied the heart of his kingdom. The famous story of the king burning the peasant woman's cakes belongs to this period. It may not be true in detail, but its endurance makes sense. People needed to imagine their ruler humbled, human, and still capable of rising again. The image of a distracted king, scolded over burnt bread, does the work of 10 sermons. While Alfred vanished into the fog, Guthrum installed his garrisons and sent patrols to collect submission from nobles who preferred peace to starvation. Some fled overseas, others swore loyalty, calculating that no fugitive could return. Churches fell silent or adapted. Priests baptized children under new rulers and prayed their Latin sounded neutral. For 3 months, England's last native dynasty seemed finished. Alfred's response began as rumor. Messages slipped out of the marshes, carried by men who knew every causeway. They told the ealdormen in Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire that the king lived and was calling for the Fard, the local militia, to muster at a place known as Egbert Stone. It was a bold signal and a test of faith. Those who came risked their families and property. Those who stayed risked their conscience. Enough came to matter. By May 87-8, Alfred had transformed from a ghost into a general again. The reunion at Egbert Stone was small in numbers but large in meaning. Farmers arrived with homemade spears, nobles with weary household troops, priests with blessings and whatever food they could spare. The chronicle, usually curt, allows itself a sigh of relief. They were fain of his presence. It is one of the most quietly emotional lines in Old English. A people who thought their king gone found him standing among them, thinner but very much alive. Alfred led them east toward Guthrum's main camp near Chippenham. He knew he had perhaps a few days of momentum before fatigue returned. They marched through Selwood Forest, a corridor of green secrecy, and reached the open downs near Eddington. There, at last, both armies saw each other. For years, the war had been a series of raids, sieges, and half-battles. This one would be decisive only because both sides were too tired for another cycle. The details recorded are sparse, and that is oddly appropriate for a sleepy retelling. 2 shield walls faced each other on a slope. The Vikings had the lower ground and the confidence of veterans. The West Saxons had a hill and the anger of survival. Alfred fought in the line, not above it, pushing and shouting until his voice cracked. The battle lasted most of the day, a matter of shoving, holding, and waiting for someone else to blink first. Eventually, the Viking formation buckled. The route that followed carried them back toward Chippenham, with Alfred's men in grim pursuit. For 2 weeks he besieged the fortress, cutting off supplies and waiting. Hunger did the work that swords could not. Guthrum surrendered. It was a collapse, not of courage, but of calculus. His army had no food and no friends left nearby. Alfred, and a decision that would color his legend more than any battle, spared him. The price was conversion. A few weeks later, Guthrum and 30 of his chieftains were baptized at Halle, near Athelney. Alfred served as godfather, naming him Athelstan, a gesture that transformed an enemy into a symbolic king. It was also excellent politics. By accepting baptism, Guthrum bound himself to peace in both legal and spiritual terms. The ceremony was followed by feasting at Wedmore, where the 2 leaders formalized boundaries that would soon evolve into the concept of the Danelaw. The chroniclers write about it with calm finality, as if the matter was settled, but history prefers loose ends. The great army did not disappear, it simply dispersed. Guthrum's followers moved east to settle in East Anglia, dividing land, marrying locals, and setting up small markets that traded furs and slaves alongside wheat. Alfred's Wessex, meanwhile, began the long work of reconstruction. The marsh fugitive turned into a planner, with a nation to stabilize. He started by rethinking defense. The old system, calling up every able man when danger approached, was replaced with rotation. Half the force served while the other half farmed, ensuring crops didn't fail just because politics had. He ordered the construction of fortified towns or burhs, spaced so that no inhabitant was more than a day's march from safety. The records of these sites still survive, written in lists so plain they almost hume with quiet efficiency. Each burh was assigned a garrison based on the local population, down to the last man who could hold a shield. These were not castles in the later sense, but walled markets, refuges that could also store taxes and host craftsmen. A burh was both a fort and an idea. Stability you could see. The system transformed Wessex from a vulnerable kingdom into a network of interlocking communities that could mobilize without chaos. In peacetime, they became centers of trade, and trade was the other ingredient Alfred understood. War empties treasuries, commerce refills them, education, too, became a quiet obsession. The king gathered scholars from Mercia and beyond the Channel, asking them to teach and translate. He wanted clergy and officials who could read the laws they were enforcing. He personally supervised translations of Latin works into Old English, Gregory's Pastoral Care, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, and others, so that wisdom would not depend on foreign schooling. It was the closest thing the 9th century had to open source learning. In this calmer period, his children grew. Edward, the heir, learned statecraft. Ethelfled, his eldest daughter, absorbed the habits of leadership that would later make her Lady of the Mercian. Ethswith managed estates and foundations with quiet authority, ensuring the royal household remained an institution rather than a traveling camp for a man once driven into the swamps. This domestic stability must have felt miraculous. By the early 880s, the island was still divided, but the lines were clearer. Northumbria and East Anglia were Danish, Mercia, half and half, Wessex, defiantly Saxon. The border was porous enough for traders and preachers, but solid enough for soldiers. Alfred maintained diplomacy as if it were another war, letters to bishops in Rome, embassies to Francia, alliances through marriage. The tone was modest, the intent was firm. Wessex would survive by appearing reasonable until it was strong enough to be inevitable. The chroniclers end the decade on that note of cautious optimism. Alfred ruled, Guthrum ruled, and for once the sea routes were quiet. It was not peace as modern readers imagine it, but it was the absence of panic, which is close enough. People rebuilt mills, monks recopied psalms, and new generations grew up for whom the word army meant stories. Their elders told around winter fires. The long trauma of invasion had settled into the long work of administration. And administration, while dull, is the true sign of recovery. Somewhere in Winchester, Alfred might have sat with a wax tablet, drafting another law code or dictating revisions to a text about philosophy. His voice measured and slightly weary. Outside, the burh watchmen would be checking their gates as evening bells echoed across the thatched roofs. The threat from the north would never disappear completely, but for a while at least, the kingdom could exhale. And for a people who had spent 20 years measuring nights by the sound of hoofbeats, exhaling was as good as victory. Peace, or the nearest approximation available in 9th century England, drifted softly across the southern shires after Eddington. It wasn't a grand proclamation. It was the sound of hammers and the smell of fresh thatch, the rhythm of repair. The people of Wessex had survived the unimaginable, and survival in practice looked like fixing roofs and coaxing reluctant oxen back into the fields. Alfred's new designs for governance didn't arrive as speeches. They came disguised as carpenters, clerks, and cooks doing their jobs a little differently. The king began to write. His law code, or what remains of it, reads less like a revolution and more like a tidy filing cabinet. He borrowed heavily from earlier West Saxon codes and added commentary that feels quietly pastoral, reminders to treat servants fairly, to protect strangers, to temper punishment with reason. This was politics rendered in ink rather than iron. To the tired population of Wessex, it was a relief to be governed by paperwork instead of panic. At the same time, Alfred confronted an unglamorous but urgent problem: ignorance. Many clergy could barely read Latin. Many local officials couldn't read at all. The kingdom depended on men who could record taxes, copy laws, and interpret correspondence from abroad. He lamented the decline of learning not with anger, but with the sigh of a craftsman who discovers his tools have rusted. His solution was characteristic: methodical, ambitious, and faintly domestic. He invited scholars from across Britain and the continent to join his court. From Mercia came Bishop Wefydd, from Wales a grammarian named Arthur, from beyond the Channel Carricks who brought new manuscripts in satchels that smelled of sea salt and candle smoke. Winchester, once just another royal estate, turned into a classroom disguised as a capital. The king himself took lessons, learning Latin slowly and translating carefully. He began with texts that combined morality with management: Gregory the Great's pastoral care, Boethius's consolation of philosophy, and a few pragmatic histories. He didn't translate word for word. He rearranged ideas until they made sense in Old English. The prefaces sound like memos to future civil servants. This is for anyone who wishes to think clearly and govern without shame. Meanwhile, Guthrum, now Ethelstan by baptism, was ruling East Anglia as a respectable Christian monarch. He minted coins, built churches, and corresponded politely with Wessex. The arrangement was fragile but functional. Danish settlers farmed, traded, and married into local families. Their language seeped into the landscape, villages ending in by or thorps, simple markers of Scandinavian roots. The cultural blend was peaceful only by comparison to what had come before. Yet, it proved durable. Markets needed customers, and peace, even partial, was good for business. North of the Humber, Halfdan settlements in York flourished in a similar pattern. There, the Norse influence ran thicker: more ship burials, more saga-style ornamentation on crosses, more evidence that two cultures were learning to share space without liking it very much. Alfred watched from a distance, reading reports with a pragmatic calm. He didn't expect harmony, only boundaries that held. To keep them holding, he kept building. The burr system expanded like a quiet lattice across Wessex and the recovered parts of Mercia. Each site had walls of timber and earth, a market square, a mint when funds allowed, and a small permanent garrison. These fortified towns turned defense into routine. A farmer living 20 miles from the frontier could sleep knowing a signal fire might buy him just enough warning to reach safety. The burrs also stitched the kingdom together economically. Taxes collected there funded their upkeep. Trade flowing through them funded the taxes. Alfred had accidentally invented an early feedback loop. His administrative mind extended to time itself. He reformed the calendar used at court, ensuring feasts and fasts aligned properly with lunar cycles. He even commissioned a candle clock, a long taper marked by measured segments and protected from drafts by a translucent horn lantern. It wasn't precision engineering, but it worked. The idea that a king wanted to measure hours instead of battles hints at the intellectual shift taking place. Wessex was turning into a culture of scribes as much as of soldiers. Domestic life reflected the same duality. It at Ewellswood maintained her own foundation at Nunnaminster, organizing nuns, property deeds, and food supply chains with the confidence of someone who could run an empire out of a pantry. Their children matured into the next generation of what chroniclers would later call the Royal House of Wessex, though it was less a house and more an overlapping network of cousins married to their nearest allies. Edward the Elder watched his father's system and learned steadiness. Ethelflad absorbed strategy simply by being nearby. The king didn't preach bravery to them. He modeled endurance for ordinary people. Daily life improved incrementally. Trade revived along the Thames and Itchen rivers. Artisans returned to metalwork, carving new brooches and sword fittings in styles that blended Scandinavian motifs with Saxon geometry. The church sponsored scriptoria to replace lost manuscripts. Some monks even experimented with musical notation, tiny marks above the Latin text hinting at melodies otherwise forgotten. The island was thinking again. Still, the north remained unpredictable. Smaller Viking bands continued to arrive from overseas, seeking fortune in a land already parcelled out. Some joined Guthrum's realm, others drifted into the Irish Sea, harrying Wales and Scotland. Alfred responded with quiet innovation. A fleet, chroniclers call it his navy, though it consisted of elongated vessels built longer and higher than Danish longships. He designed them himself, or at least told his shipwrights to combine the best features of Frisian and Norse models. The first test voyages were promising. The first battles were mixed. Naval supremacy in the 9th century was mostly a matter of luck, with wind and tide, but the attempt signaled a shift. The sea, once a door for invasion, could also be a wall. By the late 880s, Alfred's reforms had turned Wessex into the most organized kingdom on the island. His bureaucracy, modest by modern standards, was revolutionary by contemporary one. Laws were written in clear vernacular. Coinage was standardized. Taxation followed predictable patterns rather than the whims of messengers. It's tempting to see all this as genius, but it also reflects personality. Alfred liked order, partly because illness had made his own body unreliable. A man who cannot predict his own strength learns to systematize everything else. The famous portrait of him in later chronicles, the bookish warrior with a crown, slightly askew, owes something to nostalgia, but it's not false. He balanced piety and pragmatism with the patience of someone who had already lost everything once. He prayed, yes, but he also delegated, calculated, and occasionally sulked in ways that left paperwork behind. As the decade closed, he faced smaller yet constant skirmishes along the borders. Viking groups from the continent tested the coasts of Kent and Sussex. Alfred's burhs held, sometimes after tense sieges, sometimes by negotiation. Tribute payments never fully vanished, but they became smaller and more insulting. A few silver coins handed over with the weariness of an old customer tired of renewing a bad subscription. Each exchange reinforced a new equilibrium. The South was no longer prey. Guthrum died in 890, buried in Hadley, East Anglia, under a simple Christian stone. His reign had lasted longer than anyone predicted. The Danes of his realm were now farmers with English-speaking children. Alfred marked the death with respectful quiet, sending condolences and perhaps a discreet emissary to make sure no one ambitious planned to march west. He preferred known quantities. In those same years, his attention turned toward the next threat, less visible, more abstract, The Carolingian Empire, across the Channel, was fracturing, and refugee scholars, merchants, and monks carried news of continental disorder. Alfred invited some of them to Wessex, offering sanctuary and employment. What began as generosity doubled as recruitment. Educated immigrants filled gaps in the kingdom's administration. Winchester's schools swelled with students who would later staff monasteries as far north as York. He also kept up correspondence with bishops in Europe. The letters, preserved in careful copies, read more like mutual encouragement than policy. They discuss virtue, governance, and the constant irritation of taxes unpaid. To modern ears, they sound serene. In context, they were survival manuals, traded between overworked administrators who feared their archives might one day be ash. The 890s, though quieter, were not gentle. Famine returned in some years. Disease lingered in port towns, where travelers brought more than trade goods. Alfred's health declined, with periods of incapacity followed by bursts of focused activity. He continued dictating revisions to law and translation projects, even when confined indoors. Asser describes him studying at all hours, using candle clocks to divide time between prayer, reading, and rest. Whether every detail is true hardly matters. The image of a tired man managing the rhythm of a kingdom by candlelight feels apt. By then, his children were grown enough to act. Edward took on military duties, commanding garrisons and repelling raids along the southern coast. Ethelflaed married Aethelred, the ealdorman of Mercia, forming a partnership that would later become one of medieval England's more functional power couples. Together, they would defend the Midlands with an energy that made later chroniclers forget she was technically not supposed to command armies. Alfred, observing this, must have felt a rare sense of continuity. The system he built would outlast him. Still, the wider island remained divided. Northumbria had its own Norse kings, occasionally fighting among themselves. The Scottish kingdoms shifted alliances, the way clouds shift wind. Ireland was a patchwork of monasteries, petty kings, and Norse towns trading in silver and gossip. England, or rather the pieces of it that might one day become England, continued adjusting to coexistence. When visitors from the continent praised Alfred as king of the Anglo-Saxons, they were acknowledging that, practically speaking, he ruled the only stable English realm left. The title was aspirational, a polite nod to unity that didn't yet exist. Alfred accepted it, not out of vanity, but because titles, like fortifications, have a way of becoming real if maintained long enough. Toward the end of his life, perhaps around 899, he worked on one last translation, Boethius's Reflections on Fate and Virtue. The philosopher's calm acceptance of uncertainty suited him. He adapted it into his own language, simplifying and softening the tone. Where Boethius had spoken of destiny, Alfred wrote of God's wisdom guiding men. It reads like a lullaby for a weary administrator. That year, his illness worsened. He withdrew to Winchester, surrounded by family, clerics, and the rustle of parchment. He died in late October, probably no older than 50, leaving behind a kingdom that functioned on habit and paper instead of constant alarm. To his people, that was miracle enough. They buried him first at the Old Minster, later moving his remains, perhaps to a new abbey he had founded. The bones disappeared over centuries of rebuilding, which feels almost intentional. He would have approved of efficiency over monuments. What he left was infrastructure and momentum. His children inherited both, along with a sense that being English might mean something beyond local loyalties. The burghs still stood, the laws still circulated, and the idea of kingship as guardianship rather than tyranny had taken root. The island, though scarred, was stitched together enough to imagine a future. That future would belong to Edward and Ethelflad, to their campaigns against the descendants of the very settlers Alfred had bargained with. It would bring new alliances, betrayals, and eventual unification. But those belonged to another stretch of night. For now, the candle gutters low in Winchester, and the man who outlasted the great heathen army finally rests, leaving his people a gift both simple and rare, the quiet habit of surviving intelligently. The kingdom Alfred left behind was small, but astonishingly functional, a patch of southern England held together by rules and memory rather than fear. It was a fragile inheritance, but he had raised children who understood fragility as the default setting of the world. His eldest son, Edward, inherited the crown. His eldest daughter, Ethelflad, inherited something harder to describe, a sense of mission sharpened by experience. Edward was not yet a legend, just a cautious man inheriting a father's impossible job. He had grown up watching Alfred balance diplomacy and illness, and he had learned the art of waiting. His younger years were spent not at courtly feasts, but in garrison towns, where every discussion eventually circled back to supply chains. He had absorbed his father's realism, along with his handwriting. When Alfred died, Edward's first act was not to boast of victory, but to secure allegiance from every ealdorman who might be tempted to test him. Wessex could not afford a civil war. Too many foreigners were still watching from the north. Meanwhile, in Mercia, Ethelflad began her own reign of sorts, though technically her husband Ethelred held the title of ealdorman. He was older and frequently ill, leaving her to handle administration, diplomacy, and eventually defense. Chroniclers later called her Merkna Helgdese, the Lady of the Mercians, a title that sounds almost gentle until you remember it meant commanding armies. She had grown up in the middle of disaster, so the presence of threats did not alarm her. She ruled as if preparing for a flood that would eventually arrive, because it always did. Edward and Ethelflad worked in quiet coordination, less sibling rivalry than synchronized persistence. Their methods were similar: build, fortify, negotiate, repeat. They expanded Alfred's burst system northward, each new fortress like a stitch closing a wound. Worcester, Warwick, Stafford, Tamworth, names that would later read like calm points on a map, were, at the time, active construction sites filled with shouting laborers and carts of timber. Ethelflad supervised some of these projects personally, appearing on horseback to inspect ditches and walls. The records mention her presence in a tone that suggests mild awe, as though even the scribes realized they were witnessing something unusual. Mercia under Ethelflad became a buffer and a bridge between Edward's Wessex and the still Danish territories of the north. She approached diplomacy the way a chess player approaches a cluttered board, moving alliances rather than pieces. She cultivated local support among English nobles, tired of Norse overlords, offering them security in exchange for loyalty. In 910, she and Edward's combined forces struck a decisive blow at Tettenhall, defeating a coalition of Danish kings who had raided deep into Mercia. The victory was not flashy, but final enough to shift momentum. For the first time in decades, the English held the upper hand. Edward continued the policy of incremental expansion. He reclaimed territory along the old Roman roads, fortifying each recovered town. His army was not vast, but his logistics were meticulous. When he moved north, he did so behind a wall of supply wagons and prepared forts, ensuring no victory could be easily undone. It was warfare conducted like bookkeeping, every gain recorded, every expense accounted for. Ethelflad's reputation grew in equal measure. Chroniclers mostly monks, found her both admirable and slightly unsettling. Women in command made them nervous, but they could not deny result. She negotiated the peaceful submission of Leicester in 918, and before her death that same year, she had established control over most of what had once been Mercia. The Norse of York even sent envoys hinting at allegiance. It was an extraordinary offer, and perhaps the closest England had come to unity since before the invasions. Her death came quietly, recorded without drama. She went to rest at Tamworth. The phrase reads like a prayer. Her daughter, Althwyn, briefly succeeded her, but was soon removed, likely by Edward, who saw the need for centralized authority over family sentiment. History rarely rewards cooperation between siblings for long. Edward absorbed Mercia into his kingdom, not with conquest, but with paperwork. It was a bureaucratic annexation, one that completed the framework his father had begun. The rest of Edward's reign was methodical consolidation. He built new burghs along the Danelaw frontier, Northampton, Stamford, Nottingham, and populated them with mixed communities of Saxons and Danes. Over time, the differences blurred, at least in matters of taxes and trade. English identity, once a local accent, began to sound more like a shared language. Edward did not live to see full unification, but he left the machinery for it humming steadily. When he died in 924, he was buried beside Alfred at Winchester. The chroniclers, who had learned restraint from long habit, simply wrote, "He was a man very worthy of remembrance." They meant it as understatement, which for them was high praise. His son Aethelstan inherited the merged kingdoms, though inherited is too smooth a word. He had to fight for recognition, as all heirs did. But Aethelstan had been raised partly in Mercia, under his aunt's supervision, and absorbed both her discipline and her affection for order. By the time he became king in 94-95, he understood England as a project still under construction. His reign would turn that project into a shape recognizable to future generations. Aethelstan's education was cosmopolitan. His tutors included clerics fluent in Latin and travelers from the Frankish court. He dressed with continental elegance, foreign fabrics, jeweled belts, and collected relics as energetically as some kings collected taxes. Yet beneath the display lay the same pragmatic streak that defined his family. He continued fortifying the borders, issuing charters, and cultivating loyalty among the mixed populations of the Danelaw. In 927, he achieved what Alfred and Edward had only dreamed of. He took York, the last Norse ruler there, one of Halfdan's descendants, submitted or fled depending on which source you prefer. The chronicler's account is brief, almost cautious, as though afraid to jinx the event. With York's submission, Alston became ruler of all the English territories south of the Tweed. It was the first moment in recorded history when the island could reasonably be called a single English kingdom. The unity was imperfect and temporary, but it changed the vocabulary of power. Aethelstan styled himself Rex Totius Britannia, king of all Britain. It was both an aspiration and a boast, and for once it didn't sound absurd. His court became a magnet for scholars, exiles, and diplomats. Gifts flowed in from as far as Rome and the German duchies. Coins bearing his name circulated across lands that had never heard of Wessex a century earlier. He also codified law with a thoroughness bordering on obsession. His codes cover everything from the sale of cattle to the punishment of thieves. They reveal a mind concerned less with grandeur than with the small frictions of daily life. He wanted standard weights, honest trade, and peace on market days. an administrator disguised as a conqueror. Aethelstan's reign reached its dramatic peak in 97 at Brynberg, where he faced an alliance of Scots, Norse, and Strathclyde Britons. The battle, if the poems are to be believed, was enormous. Chroniclers, freed from the restraint of earlier centuries, described it as the moment when England's identity was forged in blood and noise. Yet after the fighting ended, Aethelstan returned to his usual calm, issuing more laws, building more churches, and quietly aging. He died in 939, leaving no direct heirs but a legacy of administration strong enough to survive weaker successors. His half-brother Edmund took the throne, then Edred after him, each dealing with fresh northern rebellions, but guided by the same principles: fortify, negotiate, record, repeat. The pattern Alfred had designed in miniature had become the structure of government for the whole country. If we step back from the timeline and look at the family, Alfred, Edward, Ethelflad, Ethelstan, we see not heroes in shining armor, but a dynasty of administrators. Their genius was not destruction, but maintenance. They understood that civilization is what remains standing when you stop to catch your breath. The bursts, the laws, the translations, the measured patience. They built an ecosystem of endurance. The descendants of their efforts would later claim grander titles, build castles of stone, and embroil themselves in continental politics. But the DNA of their rule remained visible. England's habit of combining stubborn independence with obsessive documentation can trace its lineage to this family's quiet compulsions. Aethelflad's reputation, almost erased by centuries of male chroniclers, re-emerged much later as a symbol of English resilience. Modern historians have found her charters, her fort plans, her diplomacy, and her letters, all written in that dry, practical tone that characterized her lineage. She was not a myth, but an engineer of stability, and in that she matched her father perfectly. By the mid-10th century, the island that had once splintered under the pressure of the great heathen army had become a single political organism. The descendants of settlers and the children of the conquered now prayed in the same churches, traded in the same markets, and increasingly spoke variations of the same tongue. The wars had burned away everything but necessity, and necessity had finally taught cooperation. The story of the great heathen army, which began as invasion and vengeance, ended as unintentional unification, is a strange comfort. Out of the wreckage of fear and fire came bureaucracy, law, and language. A new identity formed, not from triumph, but from relentless repair. Somewhere in Winchester, perhaps a generation after Ethelstan's death, a monk copying an old chronicle paused to sharpen his quill. Outside, children were playing in the streets of a walled town their grandparents had once fled from in panic. The bells rang for vespers. The burr still stood. That, in the end, was the point. Time moved slowly in the 10th century, like ink spreading across parchment. The wars that had once seemed endless were now becoming legend. People still told stories about Alfred's marshland refuge, though each retelling added a few more dramatic adjectives and fewer practical details. Children grew up hearing that their grandfathers had seen the great army themselves, that their towns had once been ashes, and that the quiet walls now surrounding their markets were built by a saintly king with a stomach ailment and a genius for organization. Memory, like any other human craft, softened rough edges until they fit comfortably into bedtime tales. Yet, even as the legends blurred, the systems remained. Alfred's burr network continued to shape how people lived. Market days took place under watchful guards. Toll collections followed schedules, so old they were recited like prayers. The clergy kept copying his translations of Latin works because they were both useful and comforting. The rhythm of life, steady and predictable, had become its own form of faith. Under Ethelstan's successors, Edmund, Edred, and Edwig, the kingdom stretched and contracted like a living creature breathing. There were rebellions, mostly in the north, where Norse earls treated submission as a seasonal activity. Yet the southern government never dissolved. Records continued, taxes arrived, sometimes late, and monks kept writing in careful round hands. Stability had become habitual. Edmund, Alfred's grandson, spent much of his short reign wrestling with rebellious nobles. He was young and ambitious, inclined to generosity when politics allowed it. His death, sudden and grimly mundane, stabbed at a feast while restraining a drunken criminal, reminded everyone that civilization still hung by a thread. His brother Edred succeeded him, more pious and more cautious, ruling until 955. During his time, the northern lords of York wavered between submission to England and alliances with the Norse in Dublin. Each time they broke away, Edred responded not with grand campaigns, but with the patient attrition of supplies, blockades, and diplomacy. The capital at Winchester grew busier. Its royal mint struck silver pennies, showing a cross on one side and the king's portrait on the other, a quiet announcement that order and faith shared the same space. Craftsmen carved elaborate stone crosses in Wessex style, blending old pagan knotwork with new Christian symbols. It wasn't rebellion, it was cultural recycling. Even the art was learning to integrate contradiction. By the reign of Edgar, Alfred's great-grandson, England had achieved a unity both political and ceremonial. Edgar's coronation in 973 at Bath is often treated as the symbolic birth of the English monarchy. The ceremony borrowed from both Roman and biblical traditions, staged in a monastery that smelled of incense and wet wool. Bishops anointed him with oil while chanting in Latin, and the chroniclers claim that 8 petty kings rowed his barge on the River Dee in a gesture of submission. It's almost certainly an exaggeration, but a revealing one. The English crown had become theatrical, a performance of continuity, not merely command. Edgar ruled during a period so tranquil that later historians called it a golden age. Peace never lasts, but his version of it produced enough prosperity for people to notice its absence when it vanished. Towns expanded beyond their walls. Merchants traveled more freely. Even taxation softened slightly into predictability. The burghs, once garrisons, evolved into centers of craft and trade. The same system that had defended Wessex against Guthrum now collected customs duties on Flemish cloth. Alfred's practical fortresses had turned into proto-cities. The church thrived as well, partly because peace leaves time for guilt. Monastic reformers like Dunstan, Athelwold, and Oswald pushed for stricter rules, celibacy for priests, uniform liturgy, better accounting for land rents. These were not revolutionaries. They were bureaucrats of holiness. Alfred would have understood them. Their reforms often read like management manuals, complete with fine schedules for prayer and detailed inventories of cattle. Still, under the calm surface, strain returned. Unity required constant maintenance. The northern regions, particularly York, remained culturally Norse and spiritually independent. Viking raiders still appeared on the horizon, though now they came from Norway or Denmark rather than local settlements. The next storm was forming quietly, gathering under the reign of Athelred, later nicknamed the Unready, a phrase that originally meant ill-advised rather than lazy, though both interpretations have enjoyed long careers. Ethelred was Alfred's great, great-grandson, and his misfortune was to rule a complex kingdom with a nervous administration. His youth was overshadowed by factional disputes. His mother, Queen Alfred, was a forceful presence in court politics, and the murder of his half-brother Edward the Martyr haunted the royal household. It's hard to maintain authority when your family drama doubles as state history. By the late 10th century, the Scandinavian world had changed again. Powerful kings now ruled Denmark and Norway, consolidating fleets that dwarfed the warbands of earlier centuries. The English coast, lined with wealthy towns and lightly guarded monasteries, looked tempting. Raids resumed in the 980s, first as pinpricks, then as hammer blows. For people who had grown up in the safety Alfred's descendants built, it must have felt like waking from a long dream into an old nightmare. Ethelred's government responded inconsistently, sometimes buying off raiders with tribute payments, called danigeld, sometimes ordering mass mobilizations that arrived too late. His advisors disagreed about policy, his commanders about loyalty, yet the infrastructure Alfred had designed, those burhs, those rotating levies still worked, at least intermittently. Many coastal towns survived because local militias understood what to do. The habit of defense had sunk into muscle memory, but habits cannot replace leadership forever. By the turn of the millennium, entire Danish armies were overwintering in England again. The chroniclers wrote with the weary déjà vu of men who had copied similar lines a century earlier. The names were new, but the pattern was ancient. A great pagan host, though by now most of them were technically Christian, descending on the same fertile shires. The difference this time was scale. These were no longer wandering adventurers. They were organized states looking for revenue. Ethelred paid, and paid again. The sums were enormous, drawn from taxes that strained every class. The chroniclers lamented his indecision, but rarely mentioned how impossible his position truly was. He ruled a wealthy land surrounded by ambitious neighbors, bound by the memory of a founder who had made prudence seem heroic. Every policy looked like cowardice next to Alfred's myth, yet Alfred's own method, negotiation, payment, fortification, was exactly what Ethelred was doing, only without the benefit of luck or timing. The raids escalated into invasions. In 991, at Malden, an English force under Byrhtnoth fought bravely and fell, immortalized in an Old English poem that praises courage while quietly admitting its futility. The following years saw more tributes, more treaties, and finally the arrival of a conqueror, Sweden Forkbeard of Denmark. In 1013, he seized the throne, forcing Ethelred into exile in Normandy. For a moment, Alfred's dream of an independent English realm seemed extinguished. But empires are cyclical, and memory is stubborn. When Sweden died the next year, Ethelred returned. His son Edmund Ironside fought a valiant but doomed campaign against Sweden's son Serkenert. By 1016, England had a Danish king once again. The chroniclers, perhaps too tired to be dramatic, simply recorded the change as if listing weather. They had seen kingdoms collapse before. The miracle was not that England fell, but that it kept getting back up. And Struart, to everyone's surprise, governed well. He ruled through existing institutions rather than erasing them, blending Danish and English law into a coherent system. In doing so, he validated Alfred's long experiment. The machinery of government worked so smoothly that even a foreign king could use it. Bureaucracy, it turned out, was the most contagious of all Wessex export. When Senat died in 1035, leaving a tangle of heirs and factions, the English elite began quietly inviting back the descendants of Alfred's line. They had become, in a sense, the default setting of legitimacy. Edward the Confessor, a great-great-grandson of Alfred, eventually took the throne in 1042, and with him returned the old dynasty's soft-spoken administrative habits. He preferred prayer to war, but the kingdom he ruled still bore the stamp of the long-dead builder from Winchester. Even the final Norman invasion of 1066 did not erase that foundation. William the Conqueror kept many of the same legal customs and borrowed Alfred's dream of order under a single crown. The burghs evolved into county towns. The shire courts became the backbone of royal justice. Beneath the layers of French titles and stone castles, the skeleton of Alfred's England endured. By then, the great heathen army was nearly 2 centuries past, a chapter in monastic chronicles and fireside songs. Its memory had transformed from terror to mythology. People remembered the Vikings as storm gods in human form, and Alfred as the candlelit savior who tamed them with patience and prayer. The reality had been messier, slower, and far more human, but myths, like architecture, survive because they offer shelter. If you could walk through a 12th century English town, past the market cross, the stone church, the reeve collecting tolls, you would still see traces of that 9th century struggle. The layout of streets, the tax rolls written in Latin and Old English, the habit of recording everything, it all descended from those weary years when survival required organization more than glory. And perhaps, somewhere in a monastery's library, a tired scribe might still glance up from his copying to watch the candle burn low, measuring the hours by its flickering shadow, unaware that the instrument in front of him, the candle clock, had once been designed by a king who couldn't sleep either. The sound of scratching quills, the steady drip of wax, the silence of walls built to last, these were the true echoes of Alfred's age. The island had not found peace so much as rhythm, a slow, durable heartbeat of law, record, and habit. Empires would come and go. Invaders would arrive under new flags. But England, the accidental child of invasion and endurance, would remain convinced that paperwork could outlast war. In the end, it often did. By the later Middle Ages, the events of 865 to 878 had drifted so far into memory that even chroniclers began to decorate them with poetry. What had once been practical terror became national origin story. The great heathen army, which in life was a shifting coalition of men seeking silver and farmland, turned in legend into a single monstrous force, the shadow against which English unity first took shape. Alfred, who had once hidden in marshes and negotiated with raiders because he had no better options, became the miracle king who single-handedly repelled chaos. Time, as it often does, improved everyone's reputation. Yet beneath the hagiography, the bones of truth remained solid. The invasion was real. The suffering was widespread. The rebuilding that followed changed how power worked on the island forever. And though the invaders lost their war for domination, they won something subtler: permanence. Their descendants became English. Their language mixed with the native tongue, and their trade routes became England's own arteries. The very enemy that had shattered the old kingdoms helped to create the possibility of one new, larger realm. The scholars who later edited the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, those patient monks writing by candlelight, seemed to sense this irony. They recorded the wars in curt entries, but their choice to keep recording it all was part of Alfred's legacy. Every royal clerk, every charter, every parchment bound in leather was an act of defiance against forgetting. To write things down was to insist that chaos could be contained in sentences. Even the dryness of the chronicle, the repetitive "this year came the army" cadence feels like ritual. If you can write it, you can survive it. As centuries passed, the ruins of the old burhs became the foundations of stone castles and walled cities. Winchester, Wallingford, Wareham, Exeter, all still bore the outlines of Alfred's grid. Their markets became permanent, their churches grew taller, their legal customs hardened into precedent. 1,000 years later, English common law would still echo with the logic of those first charters: local responsibility, mutual obligation, written record over memory. Bureaucracy as a form of civilization. The Danish settlements left their own traces in place names and pronunciation. The north and east of England spoke dialects peppered with Norse words: sky, egg, law, window, husband. Even humour changed, acquiring that dry understatement for which later English literature would be famous. Cultures don't merge politely, they seep into one another. The hybrid born of the Danelaw and Wessex was less a compromise than a slow geological process, layer upon layer, until no one remembered where one started and the other ended. If you wander through modern York, you can still feel the texture of that inheritance. Street signs read Coppergate and Fossgate, their endings fossilized from Old Norse gata, meaning road. Underneath the cobblestones lie the remains of Viking workshops, comb makers, metal workers, merchants who dealt in amber and silver. Nearby, in churches that long ago replaced pagan halls, the tombstones mix runic motifs with Christian crosses. History didn't erase the invaders, it naturalized them. Meanwhile, Alfred's intellectual reforms became invisible through their success. His decision to translate Latin books into Old English started a literary tradition that outlasted the Latin-speaking elite. The prose style he favored, plain, rhythmic, gently moral, became the seed of later English narrative. The same cadence that guided sermons and chronicles would one day echo, faintly, in everything from Chaucer's storytelling to legal documents to bedtime histories, like this one. His experiment in accessibility altered the trajectory of the language itself. The human details, though, remain the most haunting. Alfred's illness, so casually described by chroniclers, shaped every decision he made. Pain limits options, and limitation breeds creativity. His reliance on routine, on written systems, on delegation, all bear the stamp of a man who could not rely on constant strength. It's not that weakness made him wise, but that endurance trained him in patience. His was a kingdom built not by heroics, but by scheduling. The same could be said for Ethelfled, whose story nearly vanished because she didn't fit the chronicler's preferred pattern. Her fortifications across Mercia were the physical continuation of her father's blueprint. The stones she set in place at Tamworth and Stafford would one day anchor entire towns. Even her diplomacy anticipated the political balance that England would maintain for centuries. Firm but not flamboyant, pragmatic rather than theatrical. She led without myth, which is precisely why myth nearly forgot her. As for the great heathen army itself, its leaders dissolve into mist beyond a few carved names. Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan, Guthrum, figures half shadow, half memory. Archaeologists now find their traces in graves and hoards scattered from Repton to East Anglia. The coins bearing Alfred's and Guthrum's names, side by side, tell a quieter story that war gave way to commerce, and enemies shared a mint before they shared a language. The most striking lesson in all of it may be how swiftly catastrophe turned into custom. Within a generation, people born under occupation were paying taxes to a king whose father had fought their fathers. Within 2 generations, they shared saints and festivals. Within 3, They shared a monarchy. Humanity adapts faster than it forgives, and forgiveness often hides inside routine. When later kings traced their ancestry, they proudly linked themselves to Alfred the Great. But they ruled through structures that owed as much to Guthrum's East Anglian Compromise as to Alfred's reforms. The very idea of regional law codes, the notion that local traditions could coexist under one sovereign, was born from that pragmatic peace treaty after Eddington. England began as a negotiated settlement. Even the church, that constant recorder of virtue, adjusted its tone. The old chronicles that once lamented heathen men eventually referred to Danes as simply another people, another subject of pastoral care. By the 11th century, monks in northern abbeys prayed for the souls of Scandinavian benefactors whose grandfathers would have burned those same monasteries. History can be savage, but memory has a long attention span for irony. As we drift forward across centuries, the pattern remains recognizable. The English state that survived into the modern era, stubborn, procedural, allergic to zeal, grew directly from those slow reforms. It is easy to forget how radical they were at the time. Written law codes, localized defense, schools for literacy, a king who preferred reading to raiding. Alfred's monarchy introduced the idea that legitimacy required competence. It's a fragile standard, but one that lingers. Even the myth of the burnt cakes carries a moral about distraction and humility, a kind of miniature sermon about paying attention. Whether or not it happened is irrelevant. The story worked because people needed their heroes fallible. A perfect Alfred would have been unrelatable. A weary, scolded Alfred felt real. The lesson was that greatness could coexist with ordinary failure. So, what became of the great heathen army in the long view? It became part of the soil. Its remnants tilled English fields, its descendants sat in parish pews, and its leaders were folded into the genealogies of noble families, who later called themselves simply English. The invaders disappeared by becoming neighbors. The defenders survived by learning to administer rather than avenge. Between them, they built a country that would one day call itself civilized without quite knowing why. When we look back now from an age of archives and databases, of borders that seem permanent until they aren't, the quiet brilliance of Alfred's response feels more modern than medieval. He did not seek glory, he sought systems. He didn't aim to defeat every enemy, but to make invasion tedious and governance automatic. In doing so, he built a prototype for resilience that would echo through plagues, conquests, and revolution. It's tempting to end with triumph, but Alfred's world never truly escaped fragility. Famines returned. Kings quarreled, foreigners invaded again. Yet the structure he built always reasserted itself, as if the island had absorbed his temperament. England could be conquered, burned, divided, but it would inevitably reorganize itself into some version of the same order. Written laws, balanced power, predictable taxes, and a mild suspicion of excitement. Perhaps that's the real legacy of the great heathen army, and Alfred's long, exhausting reply. From violence came bureaucracy, from fear came habit. The island learned that survival was not about victory, but about continuity. Even today, 1,000 years later, every civil servant filing a report, every historian cross-referencing a date, every storyteller murmuring an old chronicle's line, is participating in the same quiet resistance to chaos. If you listen closely, in the hush of libraries, in the steady ticking of clocks, in the slow measured cadence of any story that begins with long ago, you can still hear it, the echo of an age when the world almost ended, and instead invented paperwork,